In this story, my friends and I embark on a thrilling cross-country adventure that takes a terrifying turn when we encounter a staged car accident in the mountains. What starts as an attempt to help strangers quickly becomes a fight for survival against armed attackers. Our narrow escape leaves us shaken and forever cautious about the dangers that can lurk on remote roads. So, there we were, me and my crew, hitting the road for what we thought was going to be the best cross-country trip ever. Jess, my girlfriend, was all about the adventure, always pushing for the scenic routes and the hidden gems off the beaten path. Brian, my best bud since forever, was the practical one, the guy who always had the extra flashlight and a backup plan. Megan, Brian's girl, she was the voice of reason, always a bit nervous but kept us grounded. We were somewhere in the mountains, late afternoon, the kind of place where your phone's more likely to find Bigfoot than a signal. The sun was starting to dip, casting those long, creepy shadows that make everything look a little more sketchy than it probably is. But the view, man, the view was killer. Jess was hanging out the window, trying to snap the perfect shot for her Instagram, and I was just driving, keeping my eyes on the road and trying not to think about how deserted it all felt. We were cruising along this narrow, winding road when we saw it. A car, smashed up and smoking, right in the middle of the road. I slowed down, and we all exchanged those looks. You know, the ones where you're trying to decide if you're about to be heroes or just plain stupid. "Tom, we should help them," Jess said, already halfway out of her seatbelt. Brian was nodding. "Yeah, man, they might need a ride or something. We can't just leave them." Megan, on the other hand, had that worried look, biting her lip. "I don't know, guys. This feels off. Maybe we should call for help instead." I glanced at my phone. 0 bars, of course. No signal. We gotta check it out. We pulled up and got out, all cautious-like. There were 2 people, a guy and a girl, looking pretty roughed up. The guy was waving us down, limping, with his shirt all torn and bloody. "Thank God you're here," he shouted. "We had an accident. She's hurt bad." We got closer, and that's when it hit me. Something was off. The car didn't look like it had been in a bad wreck, more like it had been beaten up. And the guy's eyes, they were too wide, too desperate. Brian must have felt it too because he grabbed my arm. "Tom, something's not right." But it was too late. Jess was already by the girl, trying to help her up, and Megan was digging through our first aid kit. That's when I saw them, out of the corner of my eye. 2 more guys coming out from behind the wrecked car, moving fast. I shouted, but before I could say more, they were on us. One of them grabbed Jess, pulling her away from the girl, who suddenly wasn't so hurt anymore. The other guy had a knife, waving it around like he knew what he was doing. "Give us everything you got," he growled. "Now." Brian stepped up, trying to calm the situation. "All right, man, just take it easy. We'll give you what you want." Jess was struggling, and the guy holding her was getting more aggressive. I could see the panic in her eyes, and it lit a fire under me. I wasn't going to let these guys hurt her. I took a step forward, hands up. "Listen, just let her go. We'll give you our stuff. Just let her go." The guy with the knife smirked. "How about you give us everything and we decide what happens next?" It was all happening so fast. Brian was inching closer to the car, probably thinking the same thing I was. There had to be something in there we could use. Megan was frozen, clutching the first aid kit like it was a lifeline. Then, out of nowhere, Brian lunged at the guy with the knife. They went down hard, rolling on the ground. Jess broke free, kicking her captor in the shin, and ran towards me. I grabbed her hand and pulled her back. "Get in the car," I yelled at Megan, who snapped out of it and bolted for the passenger seat. Brian and the guy with the knife were still going at it, and I couldn't leave him behind. I ran over and kicked the guy as hard as I could, right in the ribs. He grunted and rolled off Brian, who scrambled to his feet. "Let's go," I shouted. We piled into the car, slamming the doors. I gunned the engine, and we peeled out of there, leaving those guys in the dust. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Jess was crying. Brian was bleeding from a cut on his arm, and Megan was shaking so bad she couldn't even buckle her seatbelt. We didn't stop driving until we hit a gas station an hour later. It was the first sign of civilization we'd seen, and we practically fell out of the car, babbling about what had happened. The clerk called the cops, who showed up pretty quick, given the circumstances. They took our statements and went to check out the scene, but by then, those guys were long gone. The cops said it wasn't the first time something like that had happened in those mountains. Apparently, gangs set up fake accidents to lure in Good Samaritans and rob them. We were lucky, they said. Lucky. It sure didn't feel like it. Jess couldn't stop crying, and Brian was in shock. Megan kept saying, I told you, over and over. We spent the night at a cheap motel, all of us too freaked out to sleep. The next morning, we decided to stick to the highways. No more scenic detours. The trip wasn't the same after that, but we were alive, and that's what mattered. When we got home, we made a pact. No more remote routes, no more playing heroes. We were going to stick to the well-traveled roads from now on. That little detour nearly cost us our lives, and we weren't going to forget it anytime soon. I still think about it sometimes, those guys, the way they looked at us, like we were nothing more than prey. It's a scary world out there, and you never know what's waiting around the next bend. So, yeah, that's my story. Stay safe out there, and maybe think twice before you stop to help. It might just be a trap. In this story, my friends and I stop at a deserted, eerie rest stop during a road trip through remote mountains. We quickly discover hidden cameras and disturbing messages in the restrooms. As we try to leave, a mysterious figure appears, heightening our fear. We barely escape, haunted by the realization that danger can lurk even in the most beautiful places. Enjoying the content? Subscribe now for more. It was me, Robert, my girlfriend Mary, my best buddy David, and his girlfriend Patricia. We were on this epic road trip, driving through some of the most beautiful but remote mountainous areas. It was late afternoon, and we'd been on the road for hours, so we decided to pull into a rest stop to stretch our legs and use the restroom. We'd been weaving through the mountains all day, and the scenery was breathtaking. Endless stretches of winding roads, towering pines, and the kind of silence you don't get in the city. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves, but that kind of isolation can be eerie too. It was getting late, and we hadn't seen another car for a while. The light was fading, and the shadows from the trees started to stretch longer across the road. We figured it was a good time to find a rest stop, maybe grab a bite and take a bathroom break. Hey, there's a rest stop sign up ahead, Mary pointed out, squinting at the fading sign as we approached it. It looked pretty run down, but we were desperate to stretch our legs. We pulled in, and it felt like stepping into a different world. The place was practically deserted. One sad-looking vending machine stood outside, and the building itself was small, with paint peeling off the walls. We parked and got out, the gravel crunching under our feet in the quiet. All right, let's make this quick, David said, looking around nervously. This place gives me the creeps. Patricia nodded, sticking close to him. Mary and I exchanged glances but shrugged it off. We needed to stretch our legs and use the restroom before hitting the road again. We split up. Mary and Patricia headed to the women's restroom, and David and I went to the men's. As soon as I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The restroom was dimly lit, with flickering lights that barely illuminated the grimy tiles and cracked mirrors. The smell of mildew and something else, something foul, hung in the air. Man, this place is nasty, David muttered, wrinkling his nose. I nodded in agreement and quickly went to one of the stalls. As I closed the door behind me, I noticed something odd. There were messages scrawled all over the walls, but not your usual graffiti. These were disturbing messages, written in what looked like dried blood. "Help me," one read. Another said, "He's watching." My heart started pounding. I thought maybe it was just some sick joke, but then I noticed a small hole in the wall, almost like a peephole. I leaned in closer, trying to see if it went all the way through, and that's when I saw it. A hidden camera, barely visible, tucked away in the shadows. "David, we need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me, confused, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him out of the stall. "There's a camera in there, man. Someone's been watching." David's eyes widened, and he didn't need any more convincing. We rushed out of the restroom, meeting Mary and Patricia outside. They looked just as shaken as we were. "What's going on?" Mary asked, her eyes darting around nervously. "Someone's been watching us," I said. "There are cameras in the restroom." We hurried back to the car, but as we approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. "Who's that?" Patricia whispered, clutching David's arm. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just get in the car, now." We piled into the car and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Panic set in as I kept trying, and the figure started to move closer. Come on," I muttered, finally getting the engine to roar to life. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure still standing there, watching us leave. It sent chills down my spine. We drove until we found a well-lit gas station with people around. We pulled in, hearts still pounding, and called the police. They took our report but didn't seem too concerned, just told us to be careful and stick to main roads. That night, none of us slept well. The image of that figure in the shadows, the messages on the restroom walls, and the hidden camera haunted my thoughts. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that someone out there had been planning something terrible. It was a stark reminder that even in the most beautiful places, danger can lurk just around the corner. A camping trip with my friends Thomas, Jennifer, and John turned into a nightmare. John went missing, and we found signs of a struggle and blood in the forest. We heard growling and discovered a makeshift trap. John suddenly appeared, urging us to run. We barely escaped, haunted by the shadows that followed us. We never found out what was out there, but the experience left us all deeply shaken. Let me tell you about a trip that still haunts me to this day. If you think a simple camping trip can't go wrong, think again. This one turned into a real nightmare. We arrived at this beautiful, designated camping area late in the afternoon. The sun was starting to set, casting these long, creepy shadows over the dense forest. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but we didn't think much of it. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for the night. It was me, my buddy Thomas, his girlfriend Jennifer, and another friend John. We'd been planning this road trip through the national park for months, and this spot seemed perfect for our overnight camp. As the fire crackled and we shared stories, the stillness of the night felt oddly comforting, like we had the whole forest to ourselves. But that first night, I had trouble sleeping. The quiet became unsettling, and I found myself listening for any little sound. I figured it was just my nerves, not being used to the isolation after living in the city for so long. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember, it was morning, and the campsite was buzzing with early sunlight filtering through the trees. I crawled out of my tent to the smell of coffee and breakfast cooking over the fire. Thomas and Jennifer were already up, but John was nowhere to be seen. "He's probably just taking a leak," I said, not thinking much of it. We waited for a bit, but when he didn't come back, we started to get worried. "John! John!" we called out, our voices echoing through the forest. There was no reply, just an eerie silence that seemed to swallow our calls. We decided to split up and look for him, figuring he might have wandered off and gotten turned around. The forest was vast, and it was easy to lose your bearings if you weren't paying attention. Thomas and I went one way, while Jennifer stayed at the campsite in case he came back. As we walked, I couldn't shake this growing feeling of dread. The trees felt like they were closing in on us, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. We called out for John again and again, but the only response was the distant chirping of birds and the rustling of the wind. After about an hour of searching, Thomas and I regrouped back at the campsite. Jennifer looked pale and anxious. "Did you find him?" she asked, hope and fear mixed in her eyes. We shook our heads, and the knot in my stomach tightened. "We need to look further," I said, trying to stay calm. "Maybe he just wandered off a bit too far." We grabbed some supplies and headed out again, this time sticking closer together. The deeper we went into the forest, the more unsettling it became. The sunlight barely penetrated through the dense canopy, and everything was cast in an eerie twilight. And then we found it. A clearing with signs of a struggle. Scuffed dirt, broken branches, and John's hat lying on the ground. My blood ran cold as I tried to piece together what had happened. "Thomas, this doesn't look good," Jennifer said, her voice shaky. "We need to find him," I said, my mind racing. "Let's follow the tracks and see where they lead." We grabbed our gear and started following the signs. The forest seemed darker and more foreboding as we ventured deeper. We called out for John, but there was no response. The whole time, I had this eerie feeling that we were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes set my nerves on edge. As we followed the trail, we stumbled upon more signs, scraps of John's clothing, a broken flashlight, and what looked like blood on the leaves. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the fear in Thomas and Jennifer's eyes. Whatever had happened to John, it wasn't good, and we were running out of time. The trail led us to a small, overgrown path that wound deeper into the forest. The trees here were thicker, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. It felt like we were walking into the mouth of some dark, unknown creature. "Do you hear that?" Jennifer whispered, stopping in her tracks. We all stood still, straining to hear. At first there was nothing, but then faintly, we heard it. A low, guttural growl. It sent chills down my spine, and I instinctively reached for the small hunting knife I always carried with me. "We should turn back," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper, but something in me refused to give up. John was out there, and I couldn't leave him behind. "Just a little further," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "We need to find him." We continued down the path, the growling growing louder with each step. The forest seemed to close in around us, and the sense of dread was almost palpable. We rounded a bend and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. In the middle of the path was a large, makeshift trap covered with branches and leaves. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Nearby we found more signs of a struggle, drag marks, more blood, and what looked like claw marks on the trees. "What the hell is this?" Thomas muttered, his face pale with fear. "It's a trap," I said, my mind racing. "Something or someone set this up. We need to be careful." We moved cautiously around the trap, our eyes scanning the forest for any sign of John. The growling grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from a single source. It was all around us. Panic set in as I realized we were surrounded. Suddenly, a figure burst out of the bushes, and I instinctively raised my knife. But it wasn't an animal. It was John. He was disheveled, covered in scratches and dirt, his eyes wide with terror. "Run!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "They're coming." We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran, adrenaline pumping through our veins. The growling was right behind us, and I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps closing in. We sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, our hearts pounding in our chests. We burst into the clearing where we'd camped, and I could see the relief on Jennifer's face as she saw John was with us. But there was no time to celebrate. We grabbed what we could and bolted for the car, not daring to look back. As we sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw shadows moving in the trees, keeping pace with us. It wasn't until we reached the main road that the growling finally faded away, leaving us in stunned silence. We never did figure out what was out there in the forest. Some kind of wild animal, maybe, or something else entirely. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see coming.